Oh wait, should I act like this is a brand new? No, never mind. I answered my question. Okay, so right now I'm going to show you how to make flaky pie crust. And I know that making pie crust can seem very intimidating. Maybe your great grandma has a recipe that's been passed on and there's a certain way you're supposed to make it. But one thing I know for sure is that if you're making pie crust, you should use butter, or you can use a vegan butter, but don't use shortening. Butter has that flavor that gives a richness, and you just can't replace it with shortening. So I've made this recipe with vegan butter and I find that it works great. Just make sure it's an unsalted vegan butter, otherwise it could easily be too salty. So to start off with, in this bowl, I have 2.5 cups of all-purpose flour and about a teaspoon of fine salt. Now I have 2 sticks of cold butter and I'm just going to cut this into cubes. Ideally, you would freeze the cubes after you cut them so that the butter is as cold as possible. My biggest tip with pie crust is to just keep everything as cold as possible. So there's ice water, because all of these different things are important to keeping a flaky crust. The science behind it is that when the crust goes in the oven and it bakes, the steam from the butter and the water in the crust, it escapes and then you get these flaky layers. So a good analogy is if you're making bread, you want to develop gluten in the dough, which is protein and strength. If you're making pie crust, you want it to be tender. You don't want to overwork it. So you want to work the dough as minimal as possible because you prevent it from being chewy. That's the last thing you want in a pie crust, is for it to be chewy. So I'm just going to cut the butter into cubes. This is not a required tool, but I do like to use it. You can also just use a knife or something else. These don't need to be even. It's more so about, I prefer to have the pieces of butter on the bigger side so that I can control the size they are. So at this stage, it would be ideal to put this butter in the freezer for 10 minutes, just so that the butter doesn't melt when you work with it. But the freezer in this specific space is not that cold, so it doesn't matter today. So in this bowl, I have the flour and salt, and I'm just going to toss this together with my hands. You can use a whisk, but this is a messy project, so just get into it. Just toss this to combine. You just want to make sure that the salt is fully combined with the flour, so you don't have one spot where there's a lot of salt. Now I'm going to add the butter, add all of it at once, and my favorite way to do this is to toss all of the butter pieces in flour. And this is important because it makes a barrier between the warmth of your hands and the butter, so it doesn't melt. So just toss that, and then you just smash it between your fingers to create smaller pieces. And this is where you can have a lot of fun. You know, you can really get into it, and just don't spend too much time, because you want to work quickly. You want to work quickly so that the crust is nice and flaky. So you're just looking for the pieces to be flattened. This is a piece that's way too big. But when the pieces are like this, I don't mind, because when you see the butter in the crust, that's how you know it's flaky. I think this is a great project for children. Like, I make this pie with my little brother Wadase, who hates cake. He'll tell anybody cake is the worst dessert ever. He never wants to eat another piece of cake. And so he's always like, Yahshi, when are we gonna make a pie together? So we like to make this pie crust. It's super easy, and there's a lot that you can do with it. You could make mini pies, you could make larger ones, but it's just a great recipe to know how to make. And each time I smash the butter, I continue to toss it with flour so that my hands are not melting the butter, because it gets soft very quickly. Okay, so I've continued to just break down the butter into the flour, and this is what you're looking for. You want some smaller pieces because this makes sure that the dough is evenly hydrated, and then the bigger pieces are nice because you can see them, which means that the dough is going to be flaky. So at this stage, just double check that nothing is too big, because it will just melt. So this piece could be a little smaller, but that's all you're looking for. So now I have some ice water, and I normally add about half a cup for the amount of pie crust I'm making. This makes 2 crusts, so it makes enough for like an apple pie where you have a top crust and a bottom crust. So I'm gonna start by Oops, you don't want to get the ice in there. You just want to avoid the ice. I'm just going to drizzle this. And this is more so about, you want to eye it. You don't need to have an exact measurement. You just want to see what it feels like. So now I just toss it with my hands like this because I don't want to add any gluten into the crust. You want to keep it nice and tender and flaky. And I see that it's starting to come together, but I think it will need more water. But when you're adding more water, start with less because it can get hydrated very easily. Like this is starting to come together. I'm just gonna add a little bit, so drizzle. Do you hear that? Okay. And continue to just do this until it starts to really form like one mass, but it shouldn't be sticky. So you can just press it together with your hands and kind of fold it over. I think it will need a little bit more water, so I'll just slowly add a little bit more. And this will just depend on a lot of things. Some flour will hydrate quicker than others, so there's no real measurement for this. You just have to feel it. Now it's really starting to come together, and this is where I kind of like to work on the counter, but that's not comfortable for everyone, but I'm still gonna show you my preference. So now I'm gonna dump this on the counter. Move everything out of my way and just try to form this crust. It should come together. It might need more water, but let's just see. And at this point, I would basically stop because what happens is when you refrigerate the dough, all of the flour will become hydrated. So it might look dry and messy and you know how my hair looks sometimes, but you know, it will come together. It just needs some hydration, it needs some love, it needs some water. And sometimes it just, you gotta do that like deep condition. So you're just gonna put that in the fridge and it'll come together. So another thing that I like to do to make sure the pie crust is super flaky is take a knife. This is nice if you have it, but if you don't, it's okay. Cut it in half, and then I rotate, cut it in half again, and then I stack all of these on top of each other. And this just creates more layers. So you know your pie crust is super flaky. And now this gets to chill. I'll wrap this in plastic and then we chill it. Okay, so now we're gonna roll out the pie crust. And depending on how much water you added to the crust, this is where you might need to add more flour or less flour. Today I'm just gonna show you an example with more flour because, for example, if you added a little too much water and the dough is a little bit too sticky, if you add more flour when you roll it out, the dough can absorb some of that and it won't be as, you know, it's salvageable. But in an ideal world, that doesn't happen. So I'm just gonna sprinkle flour on the work surface, and you might sprinkle some on yourself. That's probably what's going to happen. And it's also a good idea to sprinkle it on your rolling pin, just so that it doesn't stick. Cover the top of the crust with more flour and then just rub it evenly across the surface. I like to do this on both sides. And then, depending on how firm it is, you might need to like go like this, get all your anger out. But I'm just gonna see if I can roll it. And then I like to rotate so that it's an even thickness. You gotta put some muscle into it. This is why my arms are toned. People always ask me, because baking is a workout. So we're just gonna roll until it's 1/4 of an inch thick, which is like this much. It's hard to explain. Then you can flip it over. The most important part is that this moves at any given time, because the worst thing is for your pie crust to stick to the surface and you have to try to pick it up and it breaks and it tears. So just make sure that it's not sticking. And then rotate. Rotate again. And flip it over. And it will probably start to crack because it's cold, but that's okay. You can just patch it up. That felt necessary. And then you just want to make sure it's even. That's the biggest thing. And what's good is that you can see the pieces of butter in the dough, which means that it's nice and flaky. Like that's a visible piece. So the dough is about 1/4 inch thick, but most importantly, whatever pie pan or pie plate you're using, you should have at least like 1 inch or 2 inches around it so that you can put it in the plate and you have room for the crust. So that's how it is right now. So this is good, if I can pick it up. And now what I like to do is take the, do I do it this way? I'm trying to remember. Yeah, I'll do it this way. You take the crust and you roll it and dust off the excess flour as you do this. You're not pushing it down, this is just to make it easier to transport. Then you put the pie plant, you put the thing right there, okay? And then I'm gonna take this and carefully unravel it. And at this stage, what's important is that you don't just press down, because you don't want to stretch the crust any more than you've already stretched it. You want to see, okay, this part, maybe we want to move this over so that we fill in this little gap right here. Just rotate it and shift. And you're just kind of draping it into the pan so that it naturally falls in there. All right, so this looks good. Now we're just going to press it into the pan. And this is where you can like use your fingers and just make sure it's in there. And then what I like to do is use scissors to trim away the excess. So I leave maybe 1 inch. Maybe this is a lot. I'll just trim about this much. It'll depend on how much you rolled out, because typically this is enough pie dough to make 2 pies instead of 1. So just trim away the excess. So with these scraps, you can save them. They can be your little snack. You can share them with your siblings and try to make friends, or whatever you have to do. You can put cinnamon sugar on them, but save these. You can do a lot with them. What I wouldn't recommend is like re-rolling it, because then the dough will just be chewy. It won't be flaky. So now with the excess on the pie, we're going to I'm going to start from here because I can show you. This is actually a little bit too big. And we're gonna tuck under and fold. So just tuck and fold. And this is making your outer crust rim. So this is where you can do a decorative edge. And at the end, we're gonna just flatten it all the way out. What's important is that it looks even, but it doesn't matter that much. Now I'm just gonna flatten it to the surface a little bit so that it doesn't puff up. And at this stage, you can do a lot of different things to decorate it. You can use a fork and press along the sides. But what I like to do is I do a crimp. And so I'll show you one way to crimp. I'm just making sure this looks even first. So you take your pointer finger and your thumb, and then you can use your other pointer finger or your thumb, whatever is comfortable. And you're just gonna pinch like this to make that shape. See, just like that. And then go as fast or as slow as you like, but that's one way of doing it. I'll show you another way. You can take a fork, you can just press like this. You may need to flour it. So those are a couple of ways you can do a decorative edge. So now that I've crimped the edges of the pie, I'm just going to chill this in the freezer for about 10 minutes. And you just want to do this so that everything firms up, it's not soft to the touch. And after that, I'll show you how we blind bake the pie crust, and we'll move on to the next step. So now that the pie crust has chilled, it's time to do what's called a blind bake. And I used to skip this step. I didn't understand why people kept saying you should do this, but now I understand. First, what we're gonna do is we're gonna dock the pie. So you're just gonna take a fork and you're just gonna prick holes in the crust. And this is important so that the steam can escape and the crust doesn't bubble up. So just do this all over the bottom and on the sides Doesn't matter how it looks, and it won't leave holes in your crust. It will fill in when it's baked. Now I'm going to take a piece of parchment paper and line the inside. I'm going to trim this, it's a little big. Or not. Place that in there, and then I'm using some lentils, but you can use any types of beans you have that you just reserve for baking, and this will weigh down the pie. So I'm just going to pour this in the center. Perfect. Now I'm going to bake at 375 for 20 to 25 minutes or until it's golden brown, and then I'll check. Why is it sliding out the oven? Okay. So I just took the pie crust out of the oven and I've actually let it cool for about 20 minutes. It should be cool to the touch. And now we're gonna fill it. Today I wanted to show you how to make something super simple, which is a banana cream pie. But if you don't like bananas, you can replace with another fruit. You could put strawberries, and you could also just make this pie however you want it. It's all about the crust. So you could make an apple pie. I'll leave a recipe for a great apple pie filling. And yeah, just have the freedom to do what you want. So I'm just gonna take these bananas that are nice and ripe, and I'm just gonna slice them into coins and put them all across the bottom, and then we're gonna top it with whipped cream and the salted caramel that we made earlier. And I'm putting the bananas first so that the crust doesn't get soggy from the whipped cream. I learned that the hard way a few times. You could also add pastry cream if you wanted to. You could drizzle dark chocolate ganache on top. There's a lot of things that you could do. And I feel like that's actually a common misconception about baking, is that, you know, everything has to be so perfect and you have to stick to a script. But once you learn the base for something, there's a lot of freedom you have. So now I'm gonna top the pie with some homemade whipped cream. And I made it in a mixer, but there's plenty of times that I've made it by hand. If you're making it by hand, maybe you just pass it around to the family so everyone can get a turn and it's a little bit easier. I also just wanted to mention that part of the reason why I was on the Kids Baking Championship was we had to make a pie. We had to make a pie in our audition and before that. And so that was one of the skills that they judged us on. And I made a caramel pecan pie, which some people have known me for, and I featured that pie at a couple of pop-ups. So pie is not like my favorite dessert, but I do think it's an important dessert to being a well-rounded baker. There's a lot of good techniques that you can learn in making pie, and my younger brother adores pies, so I try to make them as often as I can just because I love making cakes, and so there's always cake in the house. I have to have the balance. So now I'm gonna take this cream and I'm just going to pile it high on top of this here and spread it around. I'm actually gonna use an offset spatula, which is probably my most used kitchen tool. So now I'm gonna take the salted caramel that I made earlier and drizzle it on top. I'm gonna go the other way. And this is what I would call a rustic pie, because anyone who knows me knows that I'm pretty particular with how I do my desserts and the plating and everything, but sometimes it's just gonna be what it's just gonna look how it looks. And yeah, that's part of it. Like, it took me so many years to really learn how to like find my favorite things to bake and like how I wanted them to look and the flavors I like to use. But this is our finished salted caramel banana cream pie, and I'm really excited. So let's slice it and dig in. Time to slice. Let's see. It sounds so crispy. That's always a good sign. looks nice and flaky. You can see all the layers going on. It's really good. It's nice and light because the whipped cream is so fluffy. The caramel adds a nice sweetness, but also like that depth of flavor because it was so smoky and it almost burned down the whole house, you know. Really did something. It added some complexity to it. What it kind of reminds me of is eating a bowl of cereal, like with bananas on there. Maybe I'm the only one who does this, like cornflakes, the milk, and then bananas. That's kind of what it tastes like. But yeah, this was a super simple recipe. You can easily keep the pie crust in your freezer and just let it let it sit in the fridge, and then it'll soften a little bit, and you can just make pies whenever you want. And yeah, it's super versatile. Put whatever you like in there, share with a friend, share with family, make your little brother happy. And I look forward to seeing you all in my next class and sharing more with you.